Time to say a very good morning once again to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Morning.
Very nice to see you, and may I just thank you once more for that fantastic debate that we had last week. A lot of people were expressing surprise that we were able to do such a civilised debate in such a civilised manner. What did you make of it? What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks to you and everyone at talkRADIO for all the work you put into doing it. I think the original idea was yours anyway, and I think everybody who's interested in having proper adversarial debate should be pleased that happened at all, and so good for that. I remain baffled by the verdicts of John Rentoul, a man who I think are quite intelligent. I'm not going to claim to have won. Debates are not objectively measurable. But I think I can claim that I didn't lose pretty strongly. And I have to say that I think if John genuinely thinks that all I ever do is mouth slogans about the COVID crisis, then he simply hasn't taken the trouble to read the many things that I've written about this, or indeed listen to any of our conversations. That's a ridiculous thing to say, and I thought I would say here on the same station where he made that ridiculous remark, that it is ridiculous, and I would urge him and anybody else who thinks that I don't have any arguments to at least read them. I'm not asking him to accept them, but I think to claim that I haven't advanced it is nonsensical. Also, the format of a debate, for goodness sake, you had to intervene frequently to make sure we didn't go on too much. It means you can't set out long essay-style explanations at every point. It would be an absurd place to do it. So to criticize me for not doing so is basically like criticizing me for not appearing naked.
Well, exactly.
It wasn't going ever to do that. So, but from beyond all that, I think it's a considerable breakthrough that such a thing should happen, and examples of other broadcasters who've shied away from doing their jobs properly, which I hope they follow, but they should acknowledge that you set the example.
Yes. No, I thank you for that. And as I say, it was always something that I wanted to do in a way which people could understand. And there limitations will always be put on these things, and there will be always things that you could say. But I said to John Rentoul on Friday, when he made those ridiculous claims, as you say, that it would be nonsensical to suggest that you've never answered any questions about anything, because you do it consistently and constantly on social media and through the conversations that you and I have had over time. And it was never meant to be a case of, here's Peter Hitchens setting out his stall as to what he thinks the government should be doing, because that's the other ludicrous thing, it seems to me, that you've been accused of, which is not providing an alternative plan, because that's not your job, is it?
Well, indeed, if I did so, people would say, well, who's he to set out a plan? I'm constantly told by the same people I'm not an expert,
right?
Which I willingly concede I'm not an expert. So why would anybody turn to me to set out a plan for dealing with the coronavirus outbreak? On the other hand, I did place in the Mail on Sunday a lengthy report of the preparations made by Her Majesty's government over many years for just such an outbreak, which they abandoned in seconds when they panicked in March last year. And people can read this extremely sensible 70-page document, which doesn't even begin to suggest many of the things that we've been subjected to, and see how an intelligent government, much like the actions of Anders Tegnell in Sweden, I'd say, could have responded to this without shutting down the country, strangling the health service, wrecking the schools, and subjecting millions of people to unemployment, misery, isolation, and all kinds of other very bad things, and not to mention wrecking an already damaged economy. We didn't need to do any of that, and we still don't need to do it, but it's, alas, with almost a year of it now having happened, a huge amount of the damage has been done, both to individuals and the country. And all one can hope is that it doesn't happen again.
Yes, well, I think so. And allegedly, we're told that the government are very, very clear that if they lift the lockdown, when they lift the lockdown, they never want to do another one. But I'm afraid I don't share their surety about that, because everything they've ever said has turned out not to be the case, and they've more or less always gone back on it.
Yeah, but you have to listen carefully to what they're saying there. What they're saying is we're going to be so cautious about lifting it because we daren't risk doing it again. And I take them at their word. But that could mean, given that they have advisors who have no responsibility except never to make any mistake for which they can be held accountable, given that several of their advisors are undoubtedly still pressing for continued restrictions for many months to come, then I think that's what we'll get. There isn't going to be a sudden moment of liberation when we're all out in the streets waving flowers and embracing each other, there will be a slow withdrawal of some of the restrictions, and many of them will persist. I think, for instance, the attempt to make us all wear masks over our faces could go on well into the winter, and who knows by then whether we aren't experiencing another virus. I'm afraid I am utterly unoptimistic about what's happening at the moment. I'd be very happy to be proved wrong, but I think there's a super caution in the government because once you have surrendered to the government all responsibility for your health and safety, you have effectively surrendered control over your own lives to them. And why are they going to give it up?
Well, exactly right. I mean, I've got in front of me here, and I've mentioned it already on the show, an email or a letter, if you like, from the Chief Constable of Sussex, a woman by the name of Jo Shiner, who's basically written to all schools to ask this question of parents. Do you know where your son or daughter spends their time? Now, allowing for the fact that they've actually at least gendered two different genders rather than several hundred genders, that's quite good. But they basically said that they are now sending officers and PCSOs to patrol hotspots where children are gathering together to mingle. And, of course, they shouldn't be doing that, they say. And if they continue to do it, they will start fining parents.
It's fascinating development, isn't it? There are several points to this. One, it's quite clear to anybody who knows the law that parents have very little control over what their children do now anyway. And if they try to exercise it, they can get into quite severe trouble. So it's ridiculous to expect them to do so. Secondly, when did this become the business of the police? The police have been transformed from a body of people who patrolled the streets on foot to prevent crime and disorder into a large body of paramilitary social workers interfering in people's business where, frankly, it often isn't any of theirs at all. I think most of us would much prefer the old sort, where they prevented crime, than the paramilitary social worker model. But that is what we now have, and it's been going on for some years, but it's accelerated hugely. It's gone from 0 to 60 to 300 miles an hour in the past year. The police have actually completely transformed their nature, and they now do a job wholly different to the one we pay them for. The interesting thing is that we pay them to boss us about, which wasn't the idea in the first place.
No, exactly right. And the thing about all of that, of course, is that the fines that have been imposed, I was learning last week, I think, at the end of last week, only 5 people have actually paid any of these lockdown fines that have been handed out. Many people are just ignoring them. Others are simply appealing them. But only 5, apparently, in the entire history of the pandemic have been paid.
Well, true, but I wouldn't draw too much attention to this because the people who are now designing lockdown 2 for the next for the next virus outbreak will have paid very close attention to the problems they've had with enforcing these fines. And I absolutely guarantee you that next time round they will be able to take the money off you on the spot, and there won't be any messing around of this kind, and all kinds of other loopholes and stretchable points about the regulations which have been discovered and in my view more or less accepted by a lot of police forces won't exist the next time round, because there are certainly people who see this as far too weak and relaxed a lockdown, and look longingly, for instance, at Australia and particularly at Victoria and Melbourne, and long to do to us what was done to them, but which they couldn't do under any British law. Watch out very carefully for what Parliament is made to get up to in the next year or so in preparation for lockdown 2.
Yes, a couple of things I wanted to bring up from events of over the weekend. I see that Duncan Bannerman got it in the neck for posting a tweet from Florida, where he's currently staying, where he said basically that everything's open. The restaurants are open, the bars are open, the clubs are open, the beaches are open. People seem to be having a reasonably good time, and they did not have anything like the sort of lockdown that we had. Similarly, in Peru, apparently, they've got terrible death rates, having had the strictest lockdown in the world, so it is adjudged. And finally, New Zealand is shutting down, I think, Auckland, because they found 3 new cases.
Well, this is a problem with the claims that have been made for the supposed success of lockdowns have actually been very poorly researched and remain extremely thinly based because of the huge inconsistency between one place and another. And one of the points I sought to make was a very large number of research papers which are now saying that lockdown is ineffective, and that the only points where it's claimed to be effective are, say, post hoc ergo propter. It happened afterwards, so it must have happened because, which is not a good argument. And the contrast between Florida and California, which for large parts of the year have very similar climates, for instance, which have adopted completely different attitudes towards shutting down. One thing which really ought to be seriously studied, but it just has to be said that people have jumped to conclusions a great deal, almost always on the side of restriction. I think that a free society should not jump to conclusions on the side of restriction, but should treat all these things as unproven until proven, and wait. Otherwise, you give your freedom away, as I said earlier, and it's gone. You can't get it back once you've given it away. It's incredibly difficult to undo this regulation that we have. It's incredibly difficult to get back the independence over your own life that you used to have when you voluntarily handed it over to the government, as we've done.
Yes. I mean, what do you make of this current argument about vaccine passports as well? Because a lot of people are interested in this. Many of them against it, of course, as you would expect. But amazingly large numbers of people who think it's a good idea, including Piers Morgan.
Well, he would, wouldn't he, as they say? But I don't. So that's our Mandy Rice Davis moment. But I just think that people should think seriously about it. I've been to countries where you have to have vaccination certificates to go. I had to go to the Congo a few years ago and had the yellow fever vaccine, which actually I later discovered was probably quite a risky thing for me to do. But you couldn't get in if you didn't have it.
So what form did that take? Did you have to wave a piece of paper at them?
Oh, you get a pretty serious piece of yellow cardboard which says you've had it.
Right.
Though I'm told that quite a lot of people they are on sale in large parts of Africa. If that's the thing you want to do. I'm not against restrictions in general, but I think they have to be again proportionate. Is it proportionate? Is the threat of this disease so great that it's proportionate to have such a major restriction placed on travel again? And the Spanish foreign minister was on the BBC this morning saying, well, no, we won't stop people coming into Spain if they haven't got vaccination certificates. But what they were going to do was put them through all those jabbing probes up their nose and possibly quarantine them before they arrive. So it'd be a clear choice. Either you have the certificate and you sail through, or you don't have it. And it's a hard time, which is very close to it being compulsory without it actually being so. Again, is this justified? Is this the sort of disease that justifies such a huge change in freedom of movement? A thing which we've almost completely lost. As I say, I keep saying this, I have less freedom of movement now as supposedly a free citizen of the United Kingdom than an East German pensioner had before the Berlin Wall came down.
Well, this is the thing. I mean,
East Germans want to get rid of them.
Yeah, I mean, we were looking at the weekend at the ridiculous possibility of possibly booking a holiday, for maybe July or something like that. And I said, I just can't. I said this to my kids and their mother. I said, look, I can't even promise to go anywhere because I don't until I know what happens to me when I come back. I.e., do I have to go into a hotel and pay 1,750 quid and not be able to do my job from my studio? If I have to go and quarantine in my house, I'm not going anywhere. I simply can't because I can't, miss being on this show and I can't. And if I don't do this show, I don't get paid, So, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in that situation.
Completely. I'm incredibly grateful for the many things which made it possible for me to spend so much of my life traveling so widely. I do feel trapped in these islands now, but at least I know that I have been to most of the places I wanted to go, because looking ahead, I've pretty much written off any prospect of serious travel for at least a year. I don't think that it's going to be remotely enjoyable to do it, even if you can do it.
No.
And so it's maybe in a year's time it might be bearable, but even then, I've actually begun to wonder whether I shall ever travel abroad again, which is an extraordinary thing for me to have to think, but it is so.
Well, Neil Oliver said something very interesting to me last week, and he wrote about it in his column that, he was supposedly due to come to London from his home in Scotland to film something. And as it got cancelled just a few days before he came because it was going to be proving too difficult with the restrictions, he kind of he heaved a sigh of relief and he said, I don't want to be that guy who actually doesn't want to go anywhere, but he's becoming that guy because of the way that the world is now kind of mapped out.
Well, first, there's no fun in it anymore, is there?
No.
Travel itself has been pared down to the basic, it was a joyless affair where you're shouted at all the time to do this, do that, not do that. And if you travel by train, as I do, most of the people who work on the trains are very nice, but the fact remains that they're empty and it's a dismal experience. There's no refreshment. It's just it's lost. It's secure. Will it ever regain it? I don't know. But I'd say it's extraordinary how we've passed from being a country with an incredibly well-travelled population who loved going abroad into one where we're now legally compelled to sit at home. And there's surprisingly little real discontent about it.
Really
People
is.
still accept the arguments for it. And I keep saying, is this proportionate? And I know John Rentoul thinks this is a slogan, but it's the starting point of all thought about.
That's a pretty good question, actually, isn't it?
Well, I don't think they can answer it. I think the answer that always comes back to me is no. It plainly is not.
No.
But why isn't there anybody in a position of responsibility who takes this view?
Yeah, exactly right. And one of the things I thought that was disgraceful that Dan Hodges did was that he continued. People said I should have pulled him up on it, and maybe I should. He continued to refer to you as a COVID denier, despite you asking him several times to stop it. But also at the end, he accused you of being part of some bizarre conspiracy theory, which you have never espoused, about Boris Johnson trying to kind of control everyone. And this is the trouble, that they move from you asking the question, is this disproportionate, to suddenly all this other rubbish.
Well, I was recommending at the weekend a very good new Russian film called Dear Comrades, which is about this massacre in a Russian town called Novocherkassk in 1962. And what the massacre was about was that the people of that living in that supposed workers' paradise had just been told that their wages were going down and prices were going up, and that this was good for them. And so when they rose up against it and were slaughtered, the whole thing had to be concealed from the rest of the Soviet people. The bodies were buried secretly. The tarmac was scraped off asphalt was scraped off the city square because the blood had been baked into it to remove all traces, and it was forgotten because it couldn't have happened, and it couldn't have happened because it was a benevolent government. And benevolent governments don't need to do that sort of thing because everybody agrees with them. We are now moving towards that sort of position, and the way in which Mr. Hodges behaved was, I'm afraid, licensed by his view that his cause is so good that people like me must be bad. And this, I've no doubt that Mr. Hodges is kind to animals and a very nice person and has lots of extremely good qualities. And I have nothing against him personally, but it seems to me once you start thinking like that about people who disagree with you, then you are on the long, hard, miserable road to totalitarianism. Yes. And that's why I objected so much to this horrible denier's expression and the conspiracy theory stuff. And I believe you were quite right to let him say it, because I think people should be allowed to say exactly what they mean. That's how we work out what they're about. This is what's gone very seriously wrong with the pro-lockdown faction, is that they have ceased to argue their case and they've simply become totalitarian enforcers. Yes. Of a belief in their own benevolence, which cannot be challenged, and which makes people like me into homicidal villains, which I don't personally believe that I am.
And also, I certainly do not believe that, and I think there are an awful lot of people listening to this who don't believe it either, Peter, so don't worry about that. But also, the premises upon which they make their arguments are basically no more than, in many cases, assertions. They're not facts, they're not scientifically proven pieces of evidence. They are simply what they think is the case. And I'm afraid, in order to do what they're doing, I'd like a little bit more than that.
Well, it's true. There is quite a lot of scientific inquiry in what they say, but a lot of it is in the modern form of scientific inquiry, of consensus, rather than of actual demonstrable, testable, falsifiable experiment, which is the sort of science I prefer. And there are things such as the R number, which seem to me to be very, very hard to quantify objectively. Yeah. There's an awful lot of subjective, and I do believe that the things like modelling, which are portrayed because scientists are involved in them as being hard science, are actually very often very much akin to guesswork. And I think we are allowed to argue about these things. I mean, people can guess right as well as wrong using modelling, but they can guess wrong, and we should be allowed to question it. And again, all I'm saying here is that there should have been more questioning, and it should have been more public. Those scientists who objected to it should have been given more of a platform rather than driven, as many of them were, into silence by something closely akin to persecution. And the media, which has been extraordinarily supine, it really should have been. It's our job, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
The question what we're told: assume nothing, believe nobody, check everything.
Yeah.
It's the basic reporter's rule. How many people have been following that?
Exactly right. And when you, as you mentioned in the debate, the propaganda campaign, which continues to convince people that if they go outdoors, they're going to kill someone. Well, how come all the supermarkets are open? How come you can still travel around by bus and train? If it's that bad, well, surely we shouldn't be going anywhere.
Well, again, be careful what you say, or somebody could take you up on that, and we could all be forced to live on food parcels delivered by men in spacesuits and not allowed to go anywhere. I'm not wholly joking. I think there will be people after this who say, well, we would have controlled it more if we'd only locked down harder and done what the French did and arrested people for being outside if they hadn't got a certificate to prove they had a right to be there. It's not impossible that this will happen again worse if we don't take this opportunity that may be coming to us, or at least a partial realization, to criticize it seriously, scientifically, rationally, to the point where it has to be conceded in politics and in the media that a mistake was made. And that it's vital for our future that debate continues. Even if my side, such as it is, has more or less lost the argument here because we've continued in shutdowns for all this time, we can still win it in the long term if we persist. But it has to be done in a civil, reasonable fashion, with opponents who are prepared to listen and who recognise that we ought to be free to criticise what's happened. And what I'm afraid Mr. Hodges represents is a tendency which says, I really ought not to be free to say that because I am a denier and a bad person. And I think that really needs to stop if we wish to continue to be a free society. And that is the crucial thing. This is actually most fundamentally, as I began my debating points on last week by saying, it is most fundamentally about freedom.
Yes, absolutely right. Peter, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed. We'll talk again very soon. Peter Hitchens, Man on Sunday, columnist, of course. Also, debater of Dan Hodges. If you haven't seen it yet, go to YouTube later on this afternoon. Go and watch it. Over 160,000 people have already watched it. Go and vote on who you think won. It can only be described in one way. It is, quite frankly, superlativity. This is Talk Radio.